Yeah, so the Spanish flu wasn't Spanish at all. No, it actually came, they believe, just, it's, nobody knows for sure, but they believe it's came from rural Kansas. Possibly. But it came from America, and then it spread to all the troops in France and British and everywhere because they took it onto boats with them. And because there was a media blackout in United States, in the UK, in France, and I forget the other place. The only people that were reporting freely, yeah, can you believe that, was Germany, France, and the United Kingdom and the United States all chose to either suppress the pandemic news or downplay the severity of the virus. So what ended up happening is, and the reason the governments wanted to downplay it was they didn't want to lower morale or cause panic during the costliest war in history. These decisions would eventually kill more people than the war itself. Isn't it amazing how the very experts, they seem to always make the wrong decisions, that in the moment you're told, no, these will save lives, but more deaths end up happening. But the one country that was not subject to censorship was Spain. And so they were reporting freely about the pandemic, and their king became ill. And because of that, that's how it got its name as being the Spanish flu, but it didn't originate there. It originated in America. But they were the only ones reporting on it because there was a blackout everywhere else. Soldiers were crowded into training facilities there on day one. This was in rural Kansas. Hundreds of recruits started checking into the infirmary complaining of severe flu symptoms. Many of these young men were healthy farm boys who were suddenly flattened by a virus. 500 were bedridden by the end of the week. When boatloads of American soldiers were shipped out, they took the virus with them. The influenza tore across Europe. It was so serious it impacted the war, with over 200,000 French and British soldiers becoming too ill to fight. The British Grand Fleet could not even be put out to sea because over 10,000 men reported sick, and German forces fell to the virus as well. The link between the war and the virus was undeniable and crushing. Troops took the virus with them on ships, trains, everywhere. Okay? So I think Chicago could have had something to do with this. I do. Chicago is literally the swamp. It was pulled up out of a swamp. And they've had nothing but a water situation forever. And it was right around this time, okay? So I'm trying to do this so I don't have to do it in two parts. It's just so involved. You have to keep in mind that Chicago has always been run by mobsters. It just has. It's always been, long before even if the DC was, Chicago was. Okay? And yet there was always this more money needed, and the federal government needing, because with the way Chicago expanded and grew, you needed more tunnels because they had to do all this tunneling underneath the city. First of all, to bring the city up out of the swamp. They had built the buildings, then they started sinking. And so even while the people were working in these high rises, what you would consider high rises back then, they were able to do this massive tunneling underneath. Yeah, that's a real thing. And they raised these buildings while these people were at work, and the people didn't even know it. I mean, they knew they were doing it, but they didn't feel any difference. But so that's literally how much of a swamp it is. But then what they were doing was the drinking water that they were drinking was the same water that they were wasting in. And so then they had to do this whole let's reverse the river thing. And so the more that Chicago had people coming in and doing business, of course, the more, hey, the mobsters are going to care more about making sure they can be the city that they're meant to be to keep that business coming in, and so cut some corners. That's my guess. And I'm just making a theory. I'm just saying this could be. I'm not saying anybody's written about this. Okay, so this is just my theory, because the Spanish flu came from America. So where you get a ton of water or a ton of vectors and viruses and all this shit. And Chicago experienced this with diarrhea, dysentery, cholera, all of this stuff over and over again. And it was because of the water. They were constantly dealing with that. And it says here, there's still arguments today about the Chicago water, not just with Chicago, but other states, even countries. I'm trying to get to it because there's so much on this that it's By 1854, the city had survived epidemics of cholera, typhoid, and dysentery, killing as many as 1,500 people at a time. Though scientists had not yet identified the germs that caused these diseases, even casual observers understood the illness spread in places with poor drainage. In swampy cities like Chicago, waterborne diseases like cholera thrived. So they were constantly doing these continual underwater tunnels, canals, and cribs. So this is obviously Chicago, yeah, the river in 2015. Tuberculosis deaths slowly, let me go a little bit ahead here, or I'll confuse people. Yet with germ theory still undeveloped, other contagions abound. Deaths from diphtheria and whooping cough soared in the late 1870s. Scarlet fever accounted for 10% of deaths in Chicago in 1877. My mother had scarlet fever, but anyway, just because I'm from Chicago. So these so-called childhood diseases continued to kill, joined in summer months by cholera infatum and other GI infections resulting from spoiled food and impure water. But most devastating was the smallpox epidemic that killed 1,180 in the late 1881. The population rose too fast for vaccination programs to keep up with. Each year from 1871 to 1881, the city removed the carcasses of 1,500 horses and tens of thousands of dogs from the streets, while 70 teams tried to cope with the garbage, ashes, and rubbish daily. Overcrowding produced deaths from tuberculosis as well as from sanitary-related contagions. The city simply had to conquer disease or stop developing. That's the key. Had to conquer the disease or stop developing. How would you do that? Well, we have a population problem. Just a theory. In 1891, bronchitis and pneumonia killed 4,300, typhoid fever 2,000. Every year in the early 1890s, 10,000 to 12,000 children under 5 died in Chicago. But the close of the 19th century brought control of disease in a series of steps. Voters overwhelmingly approved the creation of the Sanitary District of Chicago in the late 1889. And January 1990, the city opened the Sanitary and Ship Canal, which permanently reversed the flow of the river, sending sewage and refuse away from Lake Michigan and southwestward toward the Mississippi. Pasteurizing of milk began in 1909 and chlorinating of the city's water supply in 1912. Chlorinating the city's water supply in 1912. Tens of thousands received diphtheria vaccine. So it's right around the time when all this took place. And it's Chicago. So I just think it's rather curious, the water and all these viruses.